It has been 80 years since the end of one worldwide conflict led right into another. The Cold War began as the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union cracked as the Nazi regime fell, and the two sides could not agree on what should happen in post-war Europe. But the next 40 years would shape the world as those two countries engaged in a worldwide chess game of influence. As both sides grew stockpiles of nuclear weapons, each side knew that direct war with one another would be folly and bring about the end of mankind. But instead, they strengthened and toppled regimes and used the CIA, KGB, and the space race to win countries around the world to their side. No one knew who would win this existential worldwide conflict until the Soviet Union showed weakness in the 1980s and finally fell in 1991. But the world had changed. And even though the Cold War officially ended, the influence of the battle between capitalism and communism changed many countries around the world. Twilight Struggle is the game that best encapsulates this struggle for ideological and world dominance. A two-player game, the start of the game is in the post-World War II time period, and the goal of each team is to assert their influence to score the points they need to win the game. The scoring system is a tug-of-war, where each side tries to get 20 more points than their opponent to win. The game is played in 10 turns, unless the game ends earlier through a point total victory or nuclear war. The first 3 turns are the early war, turns 4 through 7 are mid-war, and 8 through 10 are late war. Players draw 8 cards in the beginning of the game, and during the early war turns, they will play the game by playing cards to take various actions, which we will discuss soon. The crux of the game is that both the United States and the Soviet Union want to influence countries around the world to be in their favor. Each country has a number next to it, and by placing that much more influence in the country than their opponent, a side can control that country. So, as an example, if France has a number of 3, and the USSR has 2 influence there, then the US would need 5 influence to control that country. Each region of the world also has scoring cards that are played throughout the game, and depending on how each of the 2 world powers are doing with their influence on the other countries at the time, one side will score points since they have stronger control over those countries. This brings me to my favorite aspect of the game. Each player starts with a deck of 8 cards, and they may or may not be drawing scoring cards from different regions of the world. Neither side can see one another's hand, so each time an opponent takes an action in a region and attempts to grow their influence, there is potential that they will drop a scoring card for that region later in the turn. To counter that eventuality, players will naturally respond by taking a move that bolsters their influence in that region to prevent from being left behind. Much of Twilight Struggle is reading your opponent and guessing what they might do next based on what they've done in the past. And while it is in your best interest to shore up all the regions of the world, being ready for what you think is the next scoring card is important as well. Before we discuss the scoring cards, let's discuss how the scoring track works. The scoring track starts in the middle at 0, and victory points by the USSR player move the marker to the left and up a row when they reach the end of the current row. The US player moves the marker to the right and down a row when they reach the end of the row. The player who hits their 20 spot with the scoring marker wins the game. How do the scoring cards work? As we discuss this question, notice that the names of the battleground countries are distinct and different from the non-battleground countries. There are 3 levels of scoring: presence, domination, and control. Presence occurs when a player controls any country in the region. Domination happens when a player controls more battleground countries than their opponent and more countries in the region overall. And they must also at least control 1 battleground and 1 non-battleground country in that region for domination. For regional control, a player must control all of the battlegrounds in the region while also controlling more countries overall than their opponent. Each region also has an additional point bonus that can be applied, and those are listed on the scoring card. Some of the regions have more than one of these bonuses. A player's strategy each turn will center around maximizing the points from the regional scoring cards. Since a 20-point differential really isn't that many points, it is critical to minimize mistakes and maximize point potential. Okay, so knowing that aiming for influence of countries and maximizing scoring cards are critical to victory, how do we actually play this game? Again, players start with their 8 cards in their hand, and they need to strategize about how they will maximize these cards. Let's look closely at what a typical card looks like. There are 3 types of cards: US, USSR, and neutral cards that aren't affiliated with either side. At the beginning, only early war cards are used in this game. In turn 4, mid-war cards are added, and in turn 8, late war cards are added. Notice that there's a number that's at the top of the card. That number is the operation's point value and can be spent to peddle influence or take other actions that we will discuss momentarily. The players can choose to take an action based on the operations or play out the event that is at the bottom of the card. However, both players are drawing from the same deck, and unfortunately, sometimes you will have your opponent's cards in your hand and you have to play it to their benefit. So when you take certain actions with the opponent's card, their event that goes against you will happen either before or after you complete your operations. At the beginning of each turn, players choose one of their cards to play as the headline card. Both players secretly decide on their headline cards, and the events of these cards are resolved before either side takes an action. From there, players go back and forth playing their action cards, doing one of the following: placing influence, realignment rolls, coup attempts, space race, and events. Since these are most of what players will be doing throughout the game, let's spend some time on each one. Placing influence is the simplest action to take. A player can place their influence equaling the number of the card that they play if they choose to place influence. Reminder that this is one of the actions that playing the opponent's card will result in their event occurring either before or after your influence is placed. Influence is placed one at a time in countries where the player already has influence, or it's adjacent to a country that has their influence on it at the beginning of the action round, or countries that are adjacent to the player's superpower country. The influence can be placed worldwide as long as the other criteria are met. Typically, it costs 1 operation point to place an influence, but placing an influence on a country that is controlled by the opponent is going to cost 2 points. Players are not limited by the numbers on the influence pieces, and they can use alternative markers from outside the game if they run out. Place larger influence numbers on top if you stack the influence numbers, and either player can look at them at any time. Realignment rolls do the opposite of placing influence. They reduce enemy influence in a territory where they have influence if the roll is successful. This action also requires the opponent's events on the cards to be played either before or after the realignment rolls. The player can attempt as many realignment rolls as the number of operations on the card they play. The player taking the action does not need to have any influence in the country they are trying to realign. The risk is that both players roll a die, and the lower result removes the difference between the die rolls. So the player that attempted the realignment may have it backfire by losing influence themselves. A tie does nothing. Both players get the following bonuses to their die rolls: +1 for each controlled adjacent country, +1 for having more influence in the targeted country than the opponent, and +1 if the targeted country is adjacent to the player's superpower. If used correctly, realignment can be a powerful way to squash opposition in a country that is surrounded by their enemy and guarantee dominance in a region by the country attempting the realignment. The coup is the most powerful and drastic of the influence impacting operations actions that a player can take. This move attempts to overthrow the standing government by attempting to remove the opponent's influence, and maybe even to replace that influence with the influence of the country attempting the coup. This is the last action that requires the opponent's events on the card to be played, either before or after the coup attempt. Coups can only be attempted in countries where the opponent has influence. The player attempting the coup is not required to have influence in the targeted country. To resolve the coup attempt, multiply the stability number of the targeted country by 2. That is the number the player needs to beat. Then the player rolls a die and adds the operations number of the card that they played this turn. If the die number plus the operations number is greater than the stability number times 2, then the coup is successful, and the influence of the opponent is removed up to the difference between the die plus the operations number minus the stability number times 2. If all of the influence is removed before hitting that number, then add the coup attempting country's influence to make up the difference. We will discuss military operations soon, but attempting a coup increases the military operations track the same number as the operations on the card being played. Also, a side effect of attempting a coup in a battleground country is that the other side gets angry and DEFCON status is lowered by 1. Event cards that allow a free coup roll can ignore DEFCON restrictions that we will also discuss soon, but event based free coup rolls still result in lowering DEFCON when coups are attempted against battlegrounds. An alternative side quest action that can give helpful bonuses as the game goes on is the space race. The space race was given a high amount of attention during the Cold War as a way for the US and the Soviet Union to compete for prestige, and the space race action reflects the inordinate amount of resources as well as potential rewards from success during the space race. Each turn, players can play one card on the space race. While focusing on the space race slows down the battle for influence on the rest of the board, players ignore the space race to their own peril, because the benefits of the space race build over time and can give players game-changing advantages toward the end of the game. The advantages of the space race include, first of all, extra victory points, including a higher number for the first player to reach a space on the space race track. Number 2, advantages like the ability to take extra actions and discard held cards at the end of the turn. And number 3, importantly for both players, this is the only action taken where the opponent event does not manifest when played. This is a way to get out of a bad event happening when you play a card. When the player plays a card for the space race, they need at least the operations number that is printed below the space that they are attempting to accomplish. The first 4 space race actions require 2 operations. Number 4 through 7 require 3, and 8 requires 4. The player then rolls a die and succeeds on a die roll that fits what the board calls for. Rolls of 1 through 3 are needed for 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th places on the track. 1 through 4 are needed for the 2nd, 4th, and 6th spaces. And 1 or 2 are needed for the 8th place on the track. But that one is worth it because a success allows the player to make an extra play each turn. Success gives a reward either in the form of victory points or one of the advantages that are shown here. Let's take note though, for these advantages, only the first player to reach that space on the track gets the advantage, and that advantage is canceled as soon as the second player reaches the space on the track. There is a risk in the space race, as failure is a wasted turn, but success gives an advantage over the opponent or keeps a player from falling behind and giving their opponent extra tools if their opponent focuses on the space race as well. Reaching the last space on the space race means that the player can no longer get rid of cards to use with the space race, but by reaching the end, they have helped their cause in winning the Cold War. The last action that players can take is to ignore the operations points on the card entirely and play a card for the event text on the bottom. Naturally, this is not something a player should do when the card is their opponent's card, and that will cause the event to occur anyway. But this can be very advantageous when the card is a neutral card or a player's own card that can help them accomplish their goals. There are a variety of events that can play out in Twilight Struggle, but it is notable that there are events that have an asterisk that are unique cards that can only be played once in the entire game for their event text. And as it says at the bottom of these cards, they are removed from the game after using. Take note, if these cards are used for any other purpose, whether it be influence, realignment, coups, or the space race, they will be reshuffled into the deck once all the cards in the deck have been used and the discard pile is reshuffled. But when the event is played as an event, its effects occur and then it is removed. Note that all of the scoring cards are reshuffled into the deck except the Southeast Asia scoring card, which is removed from the game after being scored one time. Another type of event is the permanent event, which is underlined. These events are played on the table and stay in play for the remainder of the game unless they are canceled. They should be kept in a place where they are prominently displayed for both players so they can remember the effects are ongoing. Cards that are not permanent are discarded after use or removed from the game entirely in the case of unique cards, except for the China card. Let's talk about that for a bit. The China card has a unique role in the game because it starts with the USSR player, and it is an extra option for the player that holds it. It is an additional card that doesn't count toward the total number of cards a player has in their hand. So if the limit is 8, that player can hold 9 cards. When a player plays the China card, it is handed to the opponent face down, and then it will be turned face up at the start of the next turn. The China card may not be used as a headline event. It cannot be played if it will prevent the play of a scoring card, and it cannot be played to fulfill a discard required by another card played. The China card is not required to be played if an event calls for the play of another card, or if a player does not have other cards to play in their hand with actions remaining. Let's talk about one more particular type of cards, and that is the war card. The 5 cards with war in the title do not require players to have influence in the country in question. Victory points can still be earned with success, and military operations can still be earned regardless of influence or success or failure. Another wrinkle in the game that is reflective of the arms race and proxy wars of the Cold War is the DEFCON track in military operations. While separate and distinct, they often go hand in hand in this game, as military action brings these leaders closer to nuclear war. During the Cold War, the US began with an advantage of nuclear weapons that no other country possessed following World War II. But whether by espionage or scientific accomplishment, by 1950 the Soviet Union had possession of their own nuclear weapons. Throughout the Cold War, the power of the nuclear weapons and the stockpiles for both sides would grow, to the point where nuclear weapons became a deterrent, as the firing of a nuclear weapon would result in the massive retaliation of thousands of nuclear weapons being fired back, and causing the other country to also fire their nuclear weapon stockpile and destroying both countries and maybe the world in the process. This bleak possibility cast a shadow over the entire world during the Cold War, as nuclear destruction could come at any time. The DEFCON status track shows the possibility of this happening. The higher the DEFCON number, the less likely nuclear war will happen. Different actions and cards played can impact DEFCON for better or for worse, and when DEFCON hits 1, nuclear war breaks out and the game immediately ends with the player causing DEFCON 1 to occur, losing the game immediately. Any cards that cause DEFCON to improve move the marker to higher numbers, and cards that cause DEFCON to degrade to a lower number. Another impact of lower DEFCON numbers is impacts on coup and realignment attempts. DEFCON 4 prevents attempts of both of these in Europe. DEFCON 3 also prevents them in Asia, and DEFCON 2 prevents them in the Middle East. So what about those military operations? Each player is required to do military operations each turn equal to the DEFCON number at the end of the turn. The opponent gets 1 victory point for each required military operations point a player did not receive that turn. So for example, if DEFCON is 5, a player needs 5 military operations points. The US player earned 3 military operations throughout their turn. 5 minus 3 is 2, so the USSR player gets 2 victory points at the end of their turn. How does a player get military operations points? Coups and war cards played for events give military operations points equal to the operations number on the card played. If a player allows an opponent's war event to play out when using a war card for military operations, the opponent's military operations increases as directed by the event text. Cards that allow free coup attempts do not impact military operations. So now that we have seen what happens in a turn, let's discuss what happens between turns and as the game progresses. At the end of a turn, the military operation status is accounted for. The victory points are distributed based on what we just discussed. Then military operations reset to 0 for both teams. Then a China card is flipped face up if it was used during the turn. The turn marker advances to the next turn. DEFCON status increases by 1, and cards are dealt to both players. During the early war, turns 1 through 3 replenish the hand of each player to 8 cards, not including the China card, for whichever player holds it. When moving to turn 4, move to mid-war and do 2 things differently. Mid-war cards are added to the deck, and players' hands are now replenished to 9 cards, not including the China card, and players will have 7 actions for the last 7 turns of the game, unless the space race or other cards modify their actions to 8. In turn 8, move to the late war by adding the late war cards to the deck. After all of these occurrences are completed, the headline phase for the next turn begins. Do all of these things 10 times, and at the end of turn 10, if no player has finished the game with nuclear war, control of Europe during scoring, or gaining 20 more points than their opponent on their own, then final scoring will determine the winner. All of the regions are scored at the end of the game as if their scoring card has been played, except the Southeast Asia region. And the winner is determined based on the victory point total of each player after all the regions are scored. Note that control of Europe is an automatic win even in final scoring, even if the opponent would have otherwise had a dominant victory on the remainder of the map. So that is the game Twilight Struggle. It is highly interactive, and the combination of cards drawn throughout the game makes it highly strategic and replayable. For history buffs, the faithfulness to the source material is a major plus in this game, and for all of us who play the game, we can have a better appreciation for the deception, dilemmas, and potential for destruction presented by the Cold War. This is one of my favorite games, and I highly recommend this game to anyone who wants to play what is, in my opinion, the best Cold War simulation that accounts for the entire scope of the Cold War. Comment below with your experiences playing Twilight Struggle or your other favorite Cold War or geopolitical games. If you enjoy this video and are interested in more games involving history and geopolitics, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you next time.